We'll go over understanding etiquette and the importance of that, how that relates to our communication, and then the way that communication might change and how we might use some guiding etiquette principles to think about then etiquette across virtual platforms. So all kinds of goes together. We'll also wrap up with talking a little bit about some both online and offline considerations as you navigate this virtual world. So to start us off, a little bit about University Career Services. So these are some of our virtual services that took place over summer and also taking place now this fall. So we offer virtual chat options. These actually times have changed a little bit. So on Monday, really actually every single day of the week from 10 to 12 and 2 to 4, you can access virtual chats. And what a virtual chat is, it's basically a way to talk live with a career counselor. All you have to do is go to our website, click on the Get Help live chat button, and that'll turn red during those time frames I mentioned. You'll be able to meet with a career counselor. So it's a great way to ask any quick questions you might have, especially if you want a resume review or something like that. So please take advantage of this service. We also offer career counseling appointments. These are also available all fall, and they will all be virtual. So for career counseling appointments, you can schedule those through Cougar Pathway, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Also, all of our workshops and events will be virtual this fall, just like this one. In order to join, all you have to do is exactly what you did for this. So RSVP to the event in Cougar Pathway, and then the morning of, we'll send out a link so that way you can join either the Microsoft Teams workshop, or if it's hosted through Zoom, you'll get the information for that. Something I should have mentioned too before is if you have questions about anything as we go, you're welcome to add them to the chat box. Our colleague Donna Justice will be monitoring that for us and will let us know if you have any questions. There will also be some instances where we ask you questions, and you'll be able to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you have any questions in those moments. But hopefully you can engage with us throughout the presentation today. Some of our upcoming workshops and events that we are so excited about include a number of different workshops that are geared for students who might need different things. So we have workshops specifically for graduate students, for international students, students who identify as first gen, meaning the first in their family to attend a college or university. Also for alum, we also support. And then of course, some workshops that could be really helpful for all students. So the best way to get connected with any of these workshops is just like the way you did for this one, is by going into Cougar Pathway and RSVPing for the workshop that you're interested in. So I mentioned Cougar Pathway a couple of times. So Cougar Pathway is an icon in your Access UH where you can go to RSVP for workshops, schedule an appointment, check out all of the meet and greets we have coming up with employers, which are all virtual right now and definitely in full force. It's a great way to upload your resume and get a resume reviewed, as well as apply for jobs in our job board. So a really, really great place. Think of it as kind of like an online portal to our office and a great way to connect with us.
Okay, so before we begin, I wanted to check in with all of you as we want to make sure we're covering any concerns you may have regarding virtual etiquette or the virtual workplace. So my first question to all of you is, what are you wanting to learn today that would help you feel more comfortable in the virtual environment? You can either put your answer in the chat or feel free to raise your hand, and I'll give everyone just a second to respond. So as I'm giving everyone just a second to kind of add in their questions to the chat box, I will go over some of the goals we established for today. So one is going to be understanding how communication is different from kind of our online virtual platforms versus our typical face-to-face interactions. We're also going to spend some time today identifying some etiquette standards that can help us navigate today's increasingly digital workplace, and even our digital classrooms that we're in now as well. So I'll see, I think we do have some questions or responses in the chat. So Donna, do we have any that you see?
Yeah, so some responses are, I wanted to see if there was anything I didn't already know about virtual etiquette. Etiquette during video chats, when is the appropriate time to speak and how not to interrupt others. There's a question about, is it appropriate to screenshot things you like and then share them publicly on social media? And then lastly, how can you better control when to respond or awkward pauses that would happen less in person since you get more facial cues?
Gotcha. Okay, those are some really good points. I'm just writing them down to make sure that we address them and make sure that we get those answered today. So hopefully as we go along, this will kind of help clarify some of that up for all of you. All right, so to begin, I kind of wanted to go over what does it mean when we talk about etiquette. So etiquette can be defined as the set of personal behaviors considered to be polite or expected in a social or professional setting. So by behaviors and expectations, we're really trying to make sure that we're using our behaviors to communicate our intended message to someone. So some examples that you can use behavior to communicate politeness or just utilize it in proper etiquette, perhaps. One example may be for those of us who take classes in person or we have the synchronous online option. One way I can communicate to my professor that I am on time to class and ready to learn would be to arrive maybe a couple moments early, and so that by the time class begins, I am seated and they can begin teaching. Another example may be I might make eye contact with someone if I am wanting to kind of communicate that I am attentive and paying attention to what they're listening to. And then lastly, if I am running late to a meeting or maybe I am unable to attend, I know for me, I've had a lot of technology issues with, having power and all of that. So maybe if I'm unable to make a meeting, I just notify my colleague that, hey, I'm running late and I won't be able to make it, so that I allow her to then spend that time maybe on other opportunities or other tasks that she has to do. So I've given you these examples to kind of consider, but one thing that's really critical to keep in mind is that etiquette varies across cultures and settings. So even with these examples, what works in one setting may not be appropriate or the best practice in another. And we'll kind of go over ways you can kind of determine what to do in those instances where you're not sure.
All right, so I'll give some examples of different kinds of communication and how communication relates to etiquette. So one of the things that Chelsea mentioned was, when you think about etiquette, it's a set of expectations around behaviors, and really people are interpreting meaning by what we say and do in these different contexts. And really etiquette is all about how are we showing respect. And so if you think about etiquette from that lens, there's a lot of overlap with how we communicate. So is the way that we're communicating in terms of our behaviors, our words, what we write, is that aligned with what we intend to show respect to that person? So communication is very tightly interwoven with etiquette. So we want to spend some time talking about that today and the importance of communication. You're thinking about, am I using good etiquette, and am I being respectful and appropriate when working with someone? So part of why communication is so important too is because there is a survey done by the National Association of Colleges and Employers, basically an organization that surveys employers every year to ask employers, what are some of the top things you're looking for in new hires and people that you're going to bring on? And consistently, communication skills are on that list. So that can include verbal and nonverbal communication and also written communication. So at the same time, while employers are saying it's so important, they're also saying it's really difficult for employers to find qualified applicants with those communication skills. So we can tell there's some kind of disconnect in that. Employers are saying it's really important, but they're having a hard time finding people with those skills already. So that's also why it's so important for us to spend some time today talking about communication, so you can feel really clear and comfortable about what those expectations are. So I mentioned some of these earlier. So verbal communication is anything that's spoken. So the words that I'm saying right now would fall under what is considered verbal communication, okay? Written communication is just like the words you're seeing on this screen, right? So both are really important because they help make meaning, right? They help me communicate my message and hopefully help you receive whatever messages it is I'm trying to express through these different methods. But what's also really important beyond just the words that I say or what's on this screen is also everything from my tone, my attire, all of these other what we call nonverbal cues that are so important when thinking about the message that you receive from me. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more about this nonverbal communication. So different researchers vary in the percentage of how much they think nonverbal communication impacts the message, but some percentages range from anywhere to 60 to 93%. So that really indicates that this percentage of nonverbal communication has a huge impact on not just what is said or what is written when we're thinking about what does someone mean or what is someone trying to communicate. So I mentioned some of these earlier. The tone of my voice is part of my nonverbal communication. The use of eye contact. So even though we're not face to face, I'm still looking at a screen. So there's different messages that you might pick up about whether or not I'm making eye contact with you. And then what I wear too. All of this is going to be part of my impression and how you receive what it is that I am trying to communicate. So all of these areas, the verbal, written, and nonverbal communication are all really important areas to think about when we think about how am I expressing respect and how am I using etiquette in an appropriate way and kind of following understanding and expectations around how to be communicating with people. So we were really curious to know how communication might have changed for you now that we're in this virtual world. So if you think back to March when your courses, maybe other aspects of your life too, went virtual, we wanted to just see how things might have changed in terms of how you communicate, either with your classmates, just with people in your life. So if you would like to share, you're welcome to add that to the chat, or you can raise your hand. And again, our colleague Donna will help us with kind of monitoring that so we can make sure that we hear your experience. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to think about this and feel free to share.
I know I can share one of mine actually. So for me as a student, I don't prefer to learn online. I prefer in person where I can kind of have dialogue with my classmates and my professors. So one thing that I know that's really been different for me, for instance, has been being disciplined enough to write my emails to my professors and ask questions when I have them, because I know I won't have that class time. So I know that's something that's been big for me.
Yeah, that's a great example. Would anyone else like to share how this has kind of changed how they communicate since going online? I know I can think of some examples too. So I'll share that for me, I'm writing a lot more emails than I used to. So I used to spend more time probably picking up the phone or just checking in with my colleagues and just with other people in my life. But now that I'm not seeing people in person as much, I'm writing a lot more emails. So I'm having to be a lot more intentional about what I'm writing, really communicating and expressing what I want to get across. So again, thinking about how when we write something that it doesn't capture our tone and all of these other parts of nonverbal communication that help us express ourselves, I'm having to be really intentional about making sure that I guess even more intentional about the written words, right, than what I'm able to communicate maybe over the phone or in person.
And I did notice we actually had a hand raised, Lauren. So Lorena, if you would like to unmute yourself and share for you your experience.
Yes, hi, my name's Lorena. So my experience is like same as you as well. Like I prefer in person versus online. Again, that one-on-one connection. Also, I'm very used to, being very communicative with my professor. So let's say I have a question, I like to always ask questions before or after class, get to know them, maybe visit them after class in their office and things like that, but also attending events as well, such as this. Like I enjoy that one-on-one, getting to know people, but now you're limited to that close connection with people. It's now more like, oh, it was nice meeting you once, and rarely will you ever be able to catch up again after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's definitely not only an issue with kind of the communication, being able to talk with one another, but as you mentioned, also forming those relationships can be really tricky. And while you can definitely do them in a virtual setting, they definitely require a lot more effort and a lot more creativity, for sure. Thank you for that. Let's see.
There's also a comment on the chat.
Mm-hmm.
So we have, it feels more isolating having to learn it on your own, and it's hard to make connections with classmates.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing that. And then we can kind of keep some of those in mind and how we can kind of respond in those manners as we go along too. But thank you for sharing all of those.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so next what we're going to go over is kind of some guiding etiquette principles. And these are just some general ideas that you can keep in mind as you are communicating with others online, and kind of how to navigate some of those more gray areas when you aren't as sure maybe what the right response would be. So as we mentioned, with etiquette, we really want to be mindful with what is our behavior communicating to another person. So say you're debating, should I email this person now or should I send someone a message and say this or that? You always want to keep in mind kind of these 4 principles. The first one is going to be, is my communication respectful of time and person? Just as you would do in person, you want to make sure that the other individual that you're communicating with feels respected and that you are communicating that you care about their time and the fact that they are maybe taking time out of their day to meet with you or work with you. You also want to make sure that your communication is clear and concise. If an individual is not understanding what you are trying to communicate to them, it's much less likely you're going to get an answer you're needing or you'll get the response you're hoping for. And so by being mindful of perhaps the wording you're using or the method you're communicating with can really help make sure that you get what you're needing to communicate across to the other person. You also want to consider, is my communication using the appropriate medium? So one of the great things about the virtual setting is there's many options. You can call, you can text, video chat, all of those. And so we'll kind of go over when it might be beneficial to use one or the other, but you really want to make sure if it's something maybe that's more urgent, that you're using more urgent methods to communicate with them. You also want to consider if your communication is communicating really what you mean it to. And so by that, I always recommend taking the other person's perspective. And so it's really easy for us to know what we meant in maybe a text message or in an email because we've written it, we're reading it in our own dialogue. But by flipping the conversation and taking the perspective of the other person, sometimes you can help identify maybe areas that maybe they're not as used to your word usage or maybe opportunities to make your message more clear. Okay. And then one thing to really keep in mind, just like we mentioned with etiquette, every workplace is going to have their own specific standards. So while here in a minute, we'll go over some specific recommendations for different platforms, that doesn't mean necessarily that your company, your position, or your setting will always match these standards. And so one way to really check if, to know what's being expected of you is to just ask. Oftentimes you can lean on colleagues or even your manager just to know, hey, maybe something of how quickly do you expect a response if this is a situation, or what is the protocol under these circumstances? And so if you're ever unsure, definitely feel free to seek clarification just so that you know what the expectations of you are. Okay.
And I just wanted to chime in too that also applies in class, right? So when you think about what are the expectations that your professor or instructor has, same thing, you can always seek clarification if it's not spelled out directly of you too.
Absolutely. And so I have another question for you all. So on the left, we have a hiring manager who has just emailed you because they're asking your availability for an interview for this week. On the right-hand side, we have a classmate who's just emailed you wanting to get more information about an assignment that is due in 2 weeks with you. Now, who would you respond to more quickly? And I'll give everyone just a second to respond.
So for the most part in the chats, mostly it's hiring manager, but some individuals just say my friend or both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so absolutely, if you're able to, right, you definitely want to respond to both. We don't want to leave emails unanswered. But what's interesting is that for those of you who chose the hiring manager, Donna, I don't know, was there any explanation of why they would choose the hiring manager first?
So some said the manager because the homework's not due in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But mainly just the hiring manager.
Okay, so that's absolutely one thing to keep in mind is how urgent is the message. If the hiring manager is asking, they're conducting interviews this week, you definitely want to make sure you're responding to them with enough time for them to schedule that interview and still keep you in consideration. With the friend, of course, you have that assignment due later on. So that is definitely an email that maybe you can have a little bit more time to respond to. I know for me, one thing I would consider too is the relationship you have established with these individuals. Perhaps with your classmate, you already have an established communication style. They know kind of how quickly you are to respond to things. They have methods to reach you if they need, via text, if they need something sooner. But the hiring manager, maybe I haven't interacted with this manager before. And so one way I could communicate my interest is to quickly respond to them and show that I'm actively engaging with them and I'm wanting to interview with them as well. So yeah, so those are kind of two things to consider. And you can kind of see how there's multiple things to consider when you add etiquette into the mix too, and how to consider responding to these individuals. So thank you all of you for sharing. All right, so next we're going to go into etiquette across specific platforms. And so we'll talk about the different virtual platforms you may encounter and some of those, what we talked about in the beginning, some of those considerations to each of those platforms specifically. All right, so the first one we have here is virtual meetings and events. So this is likely one of the topics that I see a lot of questions about because it's for a lot of us, it's newer as we've responded to this virtual transition. A key component here is to always keep in mind you want to act in a way virtually that you would in person. And so that's always kind of a good rule of thumb. And we'll go over some of those specifically here in a second. Some platform examples you may encounter would be Zoom, Microsoft Teams, which you're using now. And I do still see some companies in classroom settings using Skype as well. So I would say absolutely, if you're not comfortable with one of these platforms, definitely feel, like create an account, go on to it, get comfortable with it prior to having to use it. And you may find that can also be helpful to kind of utilize before the meeting. So the first example I have here is of a suggestion to kind of communicate etiquette across this platform is to log in a few minutes early. Like I mentioned in my previous example, a lot of professors, for instance, may expect you to be in the meeting on time so that they can begin presenting at their designated class time. So by logging in a few minutes early, that gives you the opportunity to address any technical issues you may have. And it also, what you may not know is the host of those meetings often gets notifications when you log on. So that individual can know when you've signed on too. So by logging in a few minutes early, you can indicate that you're ready to be at that meeting and you came perhaps prepared a little bit early. Another thing is we mentioned previously maintaining direct eye contact. That can be something that's really difficult to mimic when appropriate in the virtual setting. And so one thing that we do recommend is looking directly into the camera when you're speaking. And so to give you an example of that, I'm currently looking at the camera as I'm speaking to you. But let's say I were to be looking at a picture of you in a chat box or a little pop-out box. If I shift my view onto my screen, you can see I've lost that direct eye contact. And even more so if I look into the corner, if I have a screen in the corner, you cannot really tell where I'm looking. And so it could give the implication that I'm not attending to you. And so while it's not really natural, it's definitely something I know I've had to get used to. By looking into the camera directly, you can mimic that direct eye contact when you're wanting to achieve that effect. In addition, it seems like all of you were ready with it when you came into this meeting, but the mute button can be really useful in meetings when you're not needing to actively participate. And that really helps kind of control for any background noise. I know for most of us working from home or having to take classes at home, we maybe are having to make modifications to an environment that we're not used to having to maybe be live from. I know for me, I found out really quickly that they do lawn service outside my apartment every Tuesday. And so by having an option to mute yourself, that's kind of a way you can avoid disrupting the meeting with background noise unintentionally. In addition, so having the camera on in meetings where you are actively participating. So we had a question earlier about, how do we kind of know when the other person's talking? How do we not interrupt them? Part of that is really relying on some of those visual nonverbal cues. So as I'm speaking, you can tell that I'm actively talking, but it's harder to do that when we have our cameras turned off. And so by having your cameras on during these meetings, you can really ensure that you're able to really utilize both those verbal and nonverbal communication, and just kind of gives you some extra cues to read on during meetings. Now, if it's like a webinar or something that you're not actively participating in, many people may choose to keep their camera off, but just something to keep in mind, especially in ones that you're actively participating in. So the chat function. Many of you are utilizing our chat function, which is great. Thank you so much. But a lot of these platforms have something similar. And so let's say you have to step away for a moment. Someone asked about, how to not interrupt others, maybe if you have to step away. If that happens, or maybe if you're having technical issues that you want to quietly just let everyone know, you can always utilize that chat function to say, hey, I have to step away for a moment, I'll be right back, or I apologize, I'm having camera issues, I'll be on in a moment. And so that way you can notify others in the group without interrupting the conversation that's occurring. Now, with that said, keep in mind that there are notifications that still pop up, and there's often a sound associated with those messages. And so while that is a wonderful option to use, just make sure that you're being mindful of the fact that that could distract others if they're getting multiple chat notifications back to back. And then we also have just a note about what you would wear in person to your virtual meetings. You would actually be surprised how many times you'll find yourself having to maybe reach over for something or step away momentarily. And when that happens, you see your full attire. And so we always want to make sure that whatever individuals will see of our attire is, again, what we want to communicate, which is, maybe professionalism, or just that you're wearing what's appropriate for that context. And then one individual, just to address, asked a question about, taking screenshots. I'll add to that recording meetings. And so anytime you're wanting to kind of capture a recording or take something outside of a meeting space or a conversation, one recommendation I would have would always just be to be open to letting that individual know that is occurring. So for instance, we let everyone know at the beginning of this session that we would be recording. And that's just to let them know whatever is said here today could go in other areas as well. We only use it, for our meeting purposes, but just so you know, that it's always idea to let them know so that they can consent and be aware that what they're saying could go elsewhere. And we did have, I see a pop-up, so 1 second. So Michelle, if you'd like to unmute yourself, I saw you had a question.
Yes, ma'am. So I don't know if anybody saw that there was somebody behind me kind of interrupting the video, so I had to turn off the camera off. So let's say if another meeting occurs and I'm in a meeting, a very important meeting, and something random just happens like that again, how can I bounce back from that?
So what I hear you saying is you're kind of interrupted mid-dialogue and it kind of throws you off?
Let's say if I have my camera on and something happens in the background that interrupts, like, you know, it will catch somebody's attention and you're in an important meeting or an info session or something like that. How can you try to recover from the embarrassment?
Sure. And so I think one thing to keep in mind is what my experience has been in these virtual atmospheres is people generally are understanding that we're kind of making accommodations that we wouldn't normally be making. We're having to make adjustments. So I would say, as far as like feeling embarrassed or anything like that, just being mindful for yourself that we're all learning through this, and it's okay to kind of be struggling with the transition. But as far as, let's say, you're concerned if it interrupted something or what someone was saying, you can use that chat box and just say, oh, my apologies, or hey, I have to step away for a moment. I'll be right back, just to kind of respond to it. And other than that, the next best thing would be to just make any changes necessary. So maybe you mute your mic so that if the disruption continues, it doesn't continue to be disruptive, or perhaps you turn off your camera momentarily to go step away and then you return as soon as possible. So those would be my recommendations. Lauren, I don't know if you had any other you would chime in with.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you just for sharing that example too, because I appreciate you shared that this is like an embarrassing thing. But I think, like Chelsea was saying, this is a chance for everyone to see that we're human, that even though we, and we'll talk more about being like on and offline later, but even though we are, I think a lot of us try to have kind of structure on like this is work time and this is personal time. Everything is feeling kind of blended right now. So one of the things I would recommend doing is just acknowledge it. You can even make a joke about it, like, oh, sorry about that, such and such happened, and then just move on and go on to the next thing, especially if you're sharing. I would say, especially if you're sharing, I would say if you're maybe like on mute and not like an active participant, you could even add it to the chat, like Chelsea mentioned. But like, let's say you are presenting and that happens, or you're in a meeting, an active meeting, and that happens. I would just acknowledge it, kind of laugh it off, and then just move on. I think it's just so common, whether it's, you know, landscaping is making noises, the dog is barking, whatever it is. I think just acknowledging it can be helpful, and then you can kind of carry on with where you were. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you for asking the question.
And then I also see Kristen. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Actually, it was more of a follow-up tip, I guess, because I noticed that Michelle has just an MM as her team part here. One thing that can be helpful in that situation is to have a headshot as a part of your as a part of your login information, so that when you do turn your camera off, you are seen as a smiling image of yourself in the best light possible, so that way when your camera is off, people are still able to make that personal connection without sacrificing your privacy.
That's a great example. Thank you so much for sharing that. And you can see there's a couple of us on our chat that have that set up already. And that's something that I didn't even realize was a thing until I started using digital platforms more so. But that is a good way to kind of keep that personal component. All right.
It also helps the professors too.
Yes. All right. And then next we'll go to audio calls. So audio calls can be basically virtual meetings like this without the video turned on, or they can also just be your traditional phone call. And so when you are conducting a phone call or maybe a conference call, some things to keep in mind are that you want to make efforts, again, to kind of show you're engaged in that call by being mindful of any background noises, just like you would in a video chat. And the beauty of an audio chat is you have the freedom to kind of move around maybe a little bit more if you have to, attend to something. But that's just one thing to be mindful of, is that in audio calls, there is so much more emphasis on, your verbal cues, your speech patterns. And so because of that, you want to really control your environment to emphasize and focus on that component as much as possible. Because I know for me, just to give an example, sometimes when I will call like my mom and she'll be in the grocery store and I'll hear the overhang and hear the cashiers over the radio, it can be really distracting for me and I'll typically lose my train of thought. So just things like that to be mindful of that can be distracting or throw off the other person. You also want to make sure you're including a voicemail greeting that includes your name, affiliation, and any additional important information that they may need to know. There's been a number of times I'll call someone and maybe they don't have an established voicemail or it's full. And so I'm not able to leave a message. And maybe I don't know this person in a way where I would feel comfortable texting them, or I don't have their email. And so that can really be a way to hinder someone's ability to reach you and communicate with you. In addition, I've also had some voicemails that are just an automated, you've reached this number, which can be a little difficult because if I'm calling this person for the very first time, that can make it hard for me to know for sure that I've had the right number and that I'm leaving the message for the intended party. And then lastly, just related to your affiliation, any additional important information. Let's say you're on vacation and someone may need an urgent response. Leaving information like that on the voicemail, like, if you need urgent assistance, please call this number, or please feel free to email this email if you have, an urgent concern, can be a way just to communicate and make yourself available for those types of situations. All right. And then next we have email. And so, of course, this can be any type of email platform that you use. Now, the tricky thing with email is it's really helpful to send messages, but sometimes it's hard to know when someone's received the message or when to expect a response. And so kind of a general, suggestion we have here is to allow 24 to 48 hours to receive a response. I know one thing that can be really big right now is we're having to email so much more than we ever probably have between professors, colleagues, classmates. And so one thing to keep in mind is the other person may be receiving so many additional emails that they may need some time to get to your email. Or they may have some emails that are very urgent and that they're having to attend to first. And so giving them that time and space really goes back to communicating that respect of time in person, just to let them know, hey, I have a concern, but if it's not terribly urgent, just to give them that space to respond. Next, you want to make sure if you're using email as your method to communicate, that you're including a greeting. So that can include using their title and their name or position. The purpose for your message in a clear and concise way, and a signature. So signing off with sincerely, thank you, something of that nature with your name, affiliation like your company if that's appropriate, and then any additional contact information. So I know here, if you receive an email from me, you always see my name, that I'm affiliated with the University Career Services, and then my a phone number you can reach our offices at if necessary. And that's just a way to ensure that the other person knows who I am, that I'm affiliated. If they don't know me, they know I'm with UCS, and just also additional ways for them to reach me if necessary. Another thing with email is what's different between email and text messaging is that email should always use complete sentences and be reviewed for any grammatical errors in it. It can be tricky to get in the habit of, quick, short messages that are to the point. But especially if this is someone you're emailing who you don't have an established relationship, or it's maybe more of, it's not as casual of a connection, you want to make sure you're utilizing those complete sentences and grammar checking. The next thing will be mindful of the time/day of the week. Anymore, it's so easy to constantly stay connected to our devices and our communication methods. But we do want to be mindful that if we are emailing, maybe let's say at 11 o'clock at night, what that can communicate for some individuals might be that you're expecting a response at 11 o'clock at night. In a work setting, it may also communicate that you're working or willing to work outside of your work hours. And so by kind of being mindful of that, you can kind of consider, is this urgent enough to where it needs to be sent right now? Or can this maybe wait until business hours or school hours? You also want to check to make sure you're sending from the correct account. So a lot of times for those of us who use emails on our phones, we may have multiple accounts linked. And if you just hit reply, you may be sending from a personal account as opposed to a professional account. So just something to be aware of when you hit that composition message. And you also want to utilize an address with your first and last name. For some of us who maybe have, I have a pretty unique name, so I usually am pretty lucky in trying to create accounts with my first and last name. But if your name is maybe more common or the user is taken, you can make kind of mixtures of maybe your first initial and last name, put a period in between, but just try it best you can to identify yourself by name in professional emails.
I was just going to pause for a second to see if there are any questions that have come up as you've been covering these different platforms.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. The question is, what is the best way to address someone who continues to stay unmuted and their background noise is very distracting? Should it be a private message first and then address them while in the meeting if it continues?
So I would say it really kind of depends on the meeting. If it's a meeting where you know other people and you have relationships with everyone, or if you're presenting and maybe you're not able to pause and do a chat message, you can just say, hey, would you mind muting yourself? Or if you're maybe another participant and it's distracting, you can message them directly. But I would also say if you're the presenter, a lot of times there is an option to automatically mute other participants. And that can just kind of be a way to just kind of gently address it as well. So yes, I'm sorry, were there other questions?
There's two more. The next one is it possible to edit your name once you have created an account?
To my knowledge, I don't believe you can, unless it's maybe something through like an organization. Like if an organization has set up your account, maybe they can move or connect emails, but generally, no, that's going to create a different account to my understanding.
I know for me, for my personal email, I changed my name when I got married, but my personal email still has my maiden name in it. But I'm able to change my settings in Gmail so that hopefully when you receive an email from my personal email, it should still, whenever it says from so-and-so, it should still add the name that I've updated it to. So you should be able to do that in your profile or account settings for your email. But great question. And great option to think about too if you're already kind of set in your actual email.
There's a couple more questions. Do you all want to answer them now or wait till the end?
I would say let's hold on to them just for a moment, just to make sure we're ending on time for those who do need to be done at 1 o'clock, but we'll definitely take some time at the end to make sure we're answering them. Okay. And then the last platform we're going to talk about today specifically is going to be use of instant messaging and text. And so while many of us are probably used to texting on cell phones, what some of us may not be as used to is texting platforms like Slack, which is basically like a chat room message board type setup that some companies may use. There's also oftentimes direct messaging on Microsoft Teams or organizations that have established users. So when you are messaging someone directly, one thing you want to be mindful is how long of a message are you needing? And I'll say also how long of a response are you needing, as well as the urgency. If I want to ask Lauren a question, but there's a lot of information she may need to know or that I need to communicate, or I expect it could be a lengthy response, I'm more likely to call her and talk to her directly so that way she's not having to send a huge line of text and read a long line of text. Also, for urgency, text and instant messaging, often since they go directly and instantly to the recipient, that does indicate kind of a level of urgency, maybe more so than email would. And so because of that, just be mindful that what you're texting or messaging to someone is maybe more on the urgent side or something that couldn't better be sent on an email. That is, of course, unless they have said, I prefer texting or something like that. If they've already given that consent or that's established that, then that's perfectly fine. Another thing is to be careful of your emoji usage. I know I love using emojis because I want that other nonverbal communication to be present in texting. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is not everyone will read the same emojis in the same way. And in some settings, the preference might be to stick maybe more so to text usage versus kind of more casual pictures or emojis. So if you're unsure, one thing I always do is I wait for the other person. And if the other person sends the emoji, then I know, okay, maybe they're more open to it. But even then, be mindful of maybe over usage and just when it would be appropriate to communicate. Just like with email, you want to be mindful of the time and day of the week. So for emails, that individual may or may not instantly kind of get the email on their phone. But for most of us, if you send a text message, we will get a notification. So if I'm getting a text message at, 8 or 9 o'clock at night, again, it's that implication that you're needing an immediate response and that you're asking me to give you a response now. Because you didn't send maybe something, maybe via email or something else that seems that it's not as urgent. Also, remember that there is a person on the other side of the screen. When we use text messages, we do lose that nonverbal communication. And so it's really easy to just get so honed in on the message that we're not attending to the fact that there's another person that may be receiving that message. And so just being mindful of that can be really helpful in a texting or even in some cases an email setting as well. And then the last point is just to be aware that written communication is always retrievable, even over platforms like Slack or if someone else receives a text message. Whatever you send, once that button has been hit, it no longer is in your control. So just be aware that anything you send, if it were to ever be looked at by someone else or sent to someone else, forwarded to someone else, that is lasting. So just to be mindful of whatever you send via text or email.
I had a quick follow-up to that too. So I really appreciated the question about appreciating all the questions, but the question about a screenshot I think is so great because I think being mindful of how you're going to use that screenshot is helpful. So I think the question earlier also it was, is it okay to make that screenshot public? Since the information that someone is presenting to you or sharing with you is really only intended for those in that meeting at that time, I would definitely ask for permission. So like Chelsea said earlier, ask for consent to make sure it's okay to share that with others. Now, if you're taking like screenshots of this as we go, I think that's fine if you're using it for yourself because you're already a participant, but definitely let someone know, just like we let you know that we're recording, let someone know if you would like to share that information further out and beyond. So just something to think about when you're also thinking about that communication that's written is retrievable. And so are like screenshots and things like that too.
And then for this one, this is kind of a fun little question we have for y'all. And it just kind of goes to show these emojis. So a question, and just for the sake of time, we can just kind of discuss them. But I know for the far left one, me and Lauren were kind of discussing how we actually view each of these emojis differently. And so if you were to send an emoji to one of these emojis to us, we might view it totally different. So I know just on the one to the left, for instance, I personally use that emoji when I'm doing an eye roll. So if I were to do like an, oh, this is so frustrating, that's the emoji I choose to use. But I know, Lauren, for you, you had given another example of what it could communicate.
Yeah, for me, that's what I use when I'm not sure of something. That's my looking up to or off to the side kind of expression. So very different ways of communicating something.
Mm-hmm. And so it just kind of goes to show, and actually the official name for it is eyes looking up in Apple. So because of that, Apple keeps it very generic, but if you were to send that same emoji to me or to Lauren, you would get different communication to us. It would mean different things to us. I know this next one I use if I'm feeling maybe awkward or like, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, or I didn't mean to send that or something. That's what that one communicates to me. And then Lauren, what was that one for you?
I think I still haven't decided. I use it differently in lots of different situations. So hopefully by context, the person I'm sending it to can kind of understand what I'm implying.
Mm-hmm. And then lastly, just to give an example, this last one, I always thought of it as hands together in prayer. And I've heard other people talking about it being a high five symbol. So if you're trying to high five someone, that's the indicator for that. And then actually I learned a new way to use it from Lauren.
I use this as a way of saying thank you. So like acknowledging, like bowing to someone. And I also use it when I'm telling someone I'm going to go to yoga. So it means both.
So again, just being mindful that these emojis can mean, and any communication we use can be different based on the recipient's maybe cultural background, their experiences, their communication style. So just something to be mindful of as you think about what you want to write.
All right, so now that we've talked about these different platforms, I hope you've kind of gotten the point. Maybe I've already been feeling this since March, but it's really easy to stay connected to things. And I think sometimes that can be helpful because it can allow more flexibility and more fluidity between what we're doing online and offline. But there's always kind of a caveat to that, right? If we're always online, then how are we making sure that we're being intentional about when we disconnect too? So we just want to talk about some of these considerations that you may even have already been experiencing. So let's start off by thinking a little bit about what things are important to you in real life. And so again, for the sake of time, we'll kind of maybe just think about some for you. Some things could be, you know, taking your dog for a walk or checking in with your partner or family and friends. It could even be just having your own time for your own hobbies and interests, which may or may not be on or offline. But we just want to give you a moment to think about the things that are important to you IRL or in real life are going to be things we might have to be more intentional about making time for, given that we have so much more fluidity between online and offline these days. Okay, so think for a little bit about that. I'll share for me, even when I'm working from home, my dogs let me know when they need me to give them some attention. So I've been interrupted many times by my dogs just walking up to me and starting to bark at me because they said, you've been online too long, you need to pay us attention. So I just want to share that as an example that there might be things we just need to be more intentional about because it's easy to kind of lose track of time. And we'll talk more about some of those other considerations too. So I just mentioned this. It's easy to lose track of time when we are always connected. It's also easier to be connected to our messages all around the clock. So just like Chelsea was mentioning earlier, you might be getting messages at midnight, but we have to think about how am I sending that message and what is the level of urgency of when that really needs to be sent or when someone really needs to receive that message. So we want to be more, again, mindful of how are we spending our time and how much time is online versus offline for us. And for everybody, that's going to look different depending on your lifestyle. That said, there can also be more demands and I would say even more distractions. So as you're a part of this workshop, You may have other things going on like making lunch. You might have a family member that's trying to communicate with you about something. You might be like me and have your dog coming up and barking to you. So it's by always being connected, it can be harder to just focus on one thing. So again, there's really great flexibility in that, but sometimes it can also be distracting and harder to put our energy really and be present with the task or the activity that we're trying to engage with in that moment. And that really all relates to being more difficult to just disconnect. So we're not saying that you have to always be disconnected or always be online, because there's really great benefits to having this technology that allows us to stay connected and still be able to get things done and still, use our support system and connect with people in our lives. But just being, again, more mindful of, am I being present, and am I making time for those things that are important to me that might be offline, that I might have to be more intentional about. So some of the recommendations based on those considerations could be to maybe have a designated workspace or designated work time. So again, thinking about how can I create structure within this fluidity of where's a place that mentally is going to feel like a workspace for me, and where's a place that mentally is going to help me know that I'm off the clock and I can let my brain kind of relax and not be thinking about work or my to-do list or class assignments, things like that. We do recommend taking regular breaks from devices. Really, regular breaks in general can be helpful. Just being mindful that this kind of whole, Zoom like fatigue is a real thing. So just being mindful of how much time we're spending on the screen throughout the day, and then giving ourselves breaks, even if it's just 10 minutes, just to go out and get some fresh air or just change what our eyes are looking at. So just change the scenery a little bit. Do regularly engage in offline activities that re-energize you. So again, thinking about what's important to you in real life and making time for it. So you might have to, again, have some more structure around that. So maybe if you like working out, maybe having designated time in the morning for that allows you to re-energize, or phone a friend, or again, go for a walk. But what are those things that re-energize you that you just might have to create more structure around? So that way for you, you can more easily separate your online time versus offline time. And so with that, those are some of our key considerations across these platforms. I know some of you had questions, but we just want to thank you so much for your time. I think we are about right on time. We just have a couple minutes, which is also part of etiquette and being respectful of your time. So for those of you who would like to stay on, ask questions, please feel free to do so. And Chelsea and I will stay on for a little bit and answer any questions that you might have that maybe we just didn't get to today.
And also, please note that we do have a survey in the chat box. If you'd like to provide any feedback regarding this session, we definitely welcome that. But yeah, so we'll give everyone just a second to add some questions, and we'll start answering them.
There's some questions in the chat already.
Okay, perfect.
So first question, I was in an interview and the interviewer's network was weak and he was breaking up. What is the appropriate way to handle this situation?
I know for me, when I've been either in appointments or meeting with other professionals via maybe a video platform and their internet's weak, I will, if I'm able to, just say, oh, I'm so sorry, it's showing that there's a weak internet connection. Are you able to hear me, or are you able to see me? If that doesn't work, one way you can also respond is to maybe chat them and just say, I'm so sorry, I'm trying to connect with you, just so they can see that you're connecting with them. And in cases where it's been absolutely, there's no way I can reach them through the platform, then I will follow up with like an email just to let them know that it's happening, so that they understand it's not you not being present, it's a technological issue.
I would add to that too. It's just important to make sure that they know, because they may not know. And I know when I have frozen, I really appreciate when someone tells me and says, oh, you just froze, or it's hard to hear you, because I might have thought I communicated something that you weren't able to receive. So I think to Chelsea's point of whether using a chat or having an alternative way of communicating, whether you have each other's phone number, and in case you can't connect on video, you can call them or chat them or even email them, just to let them know that that is happening if for some reason you can't reconnect. But I think the biggest thing is just to let them know, and then be able to find another way to get connected. And that actually brings you to a really good point, that when you think about interviewing, and really any kind of interaction, technical difficulties are bound to happen. And so the way that we respond to a technical difficulty actually says a lot about our way of communicating respect and even just communicating how we navigate kind of problems and come up with solutions to problems. So I think it is helpful to think about, especially in an interview, how you navigate a technical difficulty will also kind of inform the person you're communicating with about how you might, resolve other difficulties you could encounter in the future in terms of, are you being patient? Are you really trying to overly communicate so you can resolve the communication difficulty? Things like that. So your response is a really important part of etiquette. Great question.
The next question is, if you are in a video meeting with a few people or a group and you have to leave, how can you leave the current meeting without really interrupting the person talking?
So this is actually something that I've had to kind of encounter as well in more casual circles. So one thing I will do is I'll try my best to wait for a pause in the conversation, and I'll just say, hey, I do apologize real quickly. I do need to step away, or I do need to maybe leave. That is one way to do it. But let's say there's really no break, or you think it would be rude to interject at that point. Another option would be to utilize that chat function. And that's just a quick way of just mentioning it, but not interrupting the flow of that person's dialogue and what's being said. That's what I have found to be really useful. And I'm sure Lauren has probably encountered some as well.
Yeah, I think of it just like if you were attending an in-person meeting. So if you were in person with a group of 4 or 5 people, you wouldn't just like up and leave, right? You'd probably give some kind of notice. So think about that even from the beginning. So I would say even when you're first joining the meeting, letting the people that you're meeting with know ahead of time that, hey, I'm going to have to leave 5 till, or I'll have to leave right on time because I have another commitment, and just wanted you to be aware. That's really helpful so that when it comes time later on when you do need to leave, or if you're going to chat, they'll understand because they'll have already expected because you let them know ahead of time. So think about, again, how can it be like in person? Giving that heads up can be really helpful.
Next question. I never really send emojis and usually ignore them if they are sent to me. Do you think this is okay in a professional setting?
So I know for me that example of waiting to see what another individual will send me is usually my way of gauging, because even in the same work setting, there are some coworkers or some classmates who may be more open to emojis and that kind of way of communication. And there's other people who may not feel as comfortable. So I know for me, that's how I kind of gauge it. But as far as like, is it, okay in a professional setting, I think it goes back to kind of reading that area that you're at and the environment you're in. I think that's a big component there.
And the method's really important too. So our team uses group chat to communicate with one another also for more of those real-time updates. So I'm much more likely to use an emoji in a group chat because it is established, and that is more common with that kind of use of connecting with each other. But again, I think thinking about the medium too. So I think emojis could be appropriate if you're in that kind of group chat space, whether it's with like your classmates or with your colleagues. But I would again be thinking about, is this medium the right medium for what I want to communicate as well? Or maybe is a phone call or something else that doesn't even use an emoji a more effective way to really communicate what I'm trying to get across?
And the last question, when I find it difficult to make out the words because of some unfamiliar pronunciations, what is the appropriate way to respond?
I know for me, what I tend to do is I'll acknowledge that maybe it's a word that I'm not as familiar with or I struggle with, and so I might lead with I'm going to try to pronounce this as best I can, or I might, after I say it, if I think I didn't pronounce it correctly, I'll be like, I apologize if I mispronounced it, or I might even ask if it's someone's name, for instance. I might say, oh, I'm so sorry, am I saying that correctly, or something of that nature. So I think it depends on the word and the context in that regard, but I think it's okay to acknowledge that maybe this is a word you're unfamiliar with. And if you say the word and that individual doesn't know what word you are pronouncing, you know, that's okay. Just have that conversation and clarify as best you can. And the other thing I'll do is if I know it's ahead of time, like if this is a word that I will have to use in the future, sometimes I'll even use like a pronunciation and I'll look at the word and how it's pronounced, maybe via a Google search. Those are two things that have really helped me kind of prepare if I know ahead of time. All right. Were there any other questions, Ms. Donna? Or I didn't know, if Lauren, if you wanted to add in.
Those are all the questions in the chat.
Okay.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here. We also want to share with you how to stay connected with us. So if questions come up after this, let us know. Let us know what you're thinking about, and stay connected to this and all of the events we have going on. So this week is part of this event is part of our Prepare for the Fair Week taking place this week, where we have tons of really exciting opportunities to get you connected and feeling prepared and ready for all of the upcoming career fairs this season. So you can follow us at Coug Careers that's our handle for all of these different other platforms, which now you've got a great way to know how to communicate with us across all of these. There's also some really great resources on our website here too. So thank you again for your time and being with us. And I'll let Chelsea add anything else before we close out.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank y'all for attending and for participating. It's always great to have a conversation going and making sure we're really connecting and addressing any kind of concerns or needs that everyone has. So thank y'all so much. And also, you know, just keep in mind if there's any other career prep or assistance you need, feel free to always schedule an appointment. We're here to help y'all through this process. So thank you so much for your time, and y'all have a great day.